Our guest on this edition of the Geopolitics and Empire podcast is Professor Isa Blumi, who is Senior Lecturer of Turkish Studies at the Stockholm University Institute. We will be discussing the geopolitics of the Yemen war and his latest book, Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. And we are interviewing Isa Blumi because you, the listeners, requested we have him on to discuss Yemen. I would also like to remind podcast listeners that we are a relatively young podcast managed by a skeleton crew, an army of one, myself, and that there are a few very simple actions you can take to help us. These include subscribing to our Twitter account, Facebook page, YouTube channel, and other accounts. Send us your comments and guest requests. A big help is to log into your iTunes account, find our podcast, and leave us a rating and short review. You can also support us financially via Patreon, PayPal, or Bitcoin. I would also like to clarify that the Geopolitics and Empire podcast is ideologically neither left nor right, but that we do dislike war, empire, and any form of subjugation and foreign intervention carried out by any actor. Now on to our interview. It's an honor to have you on the show, Dr. Blumi.
It's a pleasure to be on with you, and I'm looking forward to sharing this conversation with your audience.
Now, your book, Destroying Yemen, is very unique, and I highly recommend it to listeners because you approach the geopolitical situation from a vantage point perhaps not so common up until now, where you take into account not only the national and regional Yemeni and Saudi rivalries, including the GCC, but what I consider even more important, the globalist or imperial external forces that are responsible for much of the conflagration we see in Yemen. Let's first start with a bit of context and your definition of this empire, because after all, this podcast is called Geopolitics and Empire. And in your book, you describe this globalism as a system or regime that perhaps in a way does not allow any people group or nation to remain outside its technological or financial system of control, because Yemen has for a long time tried to remain self-sustainable. And I also think it's a important prism through which to analyze geopolitics in the world, because it's often kind of an elephant in the room, where mainstream media and geopolitical analysis tend to provide a sanitized version of events which omit this important talking point. So what's your definition and context?
Yes, well, I would say that it's an evolution. It's a byproduct of an evolution that is fraught with contingency, constantly modified. It's not following any kind of well laid out guidebook or plan. This is indeed a byproduct of very complicated sets of interactions throughout the world. It's while geographically we can identify the primary beneficiaries, at least until the middle of the 20th century, as being concentrated in the North Atlantic world, geographically speaking, and certainly the byproduct of innovations in accounting, in how finance capitalism evolves through companies, the creation of bond markets, the stock exchange, the relationship that this new source of money, if you will, enables certain actors to actually go beyond what had long been established principles of exchange, both material exchange and cultural exchange, to become actually envision a larger presence in the world that's monopolistic as opposed to cooperative, working along lines of a mercantilist system that operates on some basic principles of common interest, to something that actually becomes hegemonic, the investment in then cultural hegemony as opposed to just simple material hegemony. And where we're at today is empire has significantly modified to become a global project that is in itself forced due to the limits of this never-ending quest for profits, for expansion, that now there needs to be a dramatic shift, if you will. There's now an interesting, almost byproduct of this Bretton Woods regime that was established after 1944, in which supposedly the primary enterprise to continue this project of global hegemony and exploitation of the raw materials that were increasingly needed by industrial capital was tailored to service an American expansionist state that would continue this process through the most wealthy and most powerful state the world has ever known, with especially the use of threatened use of nuclear weapons if necessary. And Yemen has long been at the forefront of resisting this enterprise that really takes shape in the second half of the 19th century, and increasingly envisions the Middle East as the primary center of investment in new regimes, new technologies of knowledge that scholars have been increasingly studying in the context of post-colonial theory and things like that. So the empire, I would suggest to your readers, as we continue to, our listeners, as we continue to talk about empire, refer to it, not to see it entirely as a geographically set entity. It's certainly still siphoning off wealth, material wealth, and intellectual wealth, but also financial resources as the world economy changes to service more and more finance capitalism in its constant search for liquidity. And I put the story of Yemen since the 1990s in that context of constant effort to secure what remains of savings outside this financial capital system concentrated in equity markets and in North Atlantic world, from London, City of London, to New York Stock Exchange, etc. And I would suggest that in the process of this war unleashed on a still resilient part of the global South, empire itself is changing once again. And you can see that manifested, and that's something that I would say was a possibility. The petrodollar is coming to an end, and the apparatus that was often used by empire since the beginning of the 20th century, which tied in with the petrodollar and OPEC and the recycling of expense and spending of resources to purchase the raw materials necessary for late industrialization, is now transforming. Where it's going, we don't know. But Yemen is certainly ushering in a new era in which the instruments of empire in the form of the Saudi state is likely to end. And where it's going to go after that is still an open question.
And before we get into Yemen, one more interesting thing you write about in your book, and not only you, but previous guests that I've had on, actually Jeremy Kuzmarov, who wrote a book about the U.S.-Russia relations in the new Cold War, he mentioned the same thing that you touched upon, and that is the empire's use of higher education and universities as some kind of training technocrats to manage this system. And for me, it's interesting because I'm a bit of a roving professor, and I find this very intriguing. So in some ways, international relations or political science students are unwittingly being brainwashed into becoming technocratic managers. I remember one of my students recently, I read that she was going to work for the National Endowment for Democracy, or one of its or one of its subsidiaries, which they're involved in the
job well done, man.
Yeah,
job well done.
I tried my best, but I reached out to the student and warned her. I right when I saw in the LinkedIn the notification that the student was getting a job there, Stephen Kinzer came out with an article in the Boston Globe precisely about the NED and how Trump, at least at the time, was scaling back funding. But I'm not sure what the students' motivations was in the end were. But can you talk a little bit about the use of higher education and the problems you see there?
Yeah, that's long been a very important instrument of expanding influence in otherwise inaccessible, but still very lucrative corners of the global economy, if we want to talk in those ways. So accessing people who would actually facilitate the continuing plunder or expanding the plundering enterprise of global finance capital, or finance capitalism itself, or empire, right? Imperialism, according to Lenin, is the highest stage of capitalist exploitative. It's the iteration of the apparatus of capitalism, and as it continues to exploit the remaining parts of the world yet untouched. And at some point in time, the fusing of incorporating and co-opting eager beggars who would be more than happy to join the enterprise at the expense of their own community's long-term survival is a phenomenon of the 19th and 20th century. It starts, of course, first and foremost in the, well, it depends. Some will argue that many of the structural dynamics of empire, at least in the home front, is actually shaped by experience through the application of these administrative tools in the colonies or in the peripheries of the global economy. And that may be the case, but certainly one thing that has been perfected first in the core zone of empire is education, its use of indoctrinating a certain class of aspiring individuals who would then help implement an otherwise impossible project of expanding the capacity of the apparatus to no longer just fight wars, but also to administer and ultimately incorporate through a willful kind of investment in a global project that has been celebrated largely through these allies, if you will, of empire, who have been indoctrinated and brainwashed, or maybe as your student, as certainly some of my students who have gone the same track, are they understand very well what's going on, but they also rationalize that this is the only way for me to make money. This is the only way that I can actually protect my family from the ultimate consequences of destruction. And by the way, this is one of those fine ironies that many of the main revolutionaries of the 20th century actually were educated in the empire's main universities, with the initial intention, of course, to make them serviceable to global capitalism. So whether it be Ho Chi Minh or others, right? They actually have been able to harness some of the very tools of empire against empire. That is not the case per se in the North Yemen context, which is, I find, especially interesting. These are the people who have consistently resisted empire are actually not the products of the Enlightenment, or are often very not even capable of communicating in the discourse of the so-called West, which I find so interesting about a place like Yemen. It really is an authentically indigenous enterprise of resistance that goes back again for at least 100 years, if not earlier. So there are actually a couple of tracks that we can understand the way imperialism has worked over the period of 150 years, certainly indoctrinating a key element of the administration of empire. Certainly makes sense, but whether or not we comply, I mean, you and I have been educated as well in that system, and we certainly know how to communicate it, and many others have as well. What is increasingly clear is the options for those of us who are, in fact, somewhat rebellious or would prefer not to work for empire. The options we have are increasingly difficult to find if we want to continue to do what we do. As you yourself have admitted, you're a nomad, and I would consider myself also frustratingly itinerant in the places where I live and where I can actually find a place to continue to teach and publish from. So we're in an interesting time for those who come from the heart of this apparatus of indoctrination, but have resisted it using the same logic, if you will, the language that they use. But now the structures have changed to the point where it's almost impossible to find a job in, especially the more important, influential institutions that continue this process. Yeah. Now, there's that wonderful story of John Perkins' life story. I don't know if the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He gives this story a couple times in different mediums, but there's that one iconic interview he gives to a Boston radio station, which is recorded on YouTube, and how he was recruited to join the Peace Corps. So in the 50s and 60s, this was one access point for people who were maybe at the undergraduate level educated enough to service empire and become kind of instruments of interjecting into inaccessible parts of the world, right, under the cover of development and the charitable work of the white man who's replacing the missionaries of the 19th century by no longer bringing gospel, but bringing the gospel of modernity and development to the Amazon, or to, in the case of Yemen, many people in the 50s and 60s started their careers as Peace Corps workers or working for USAID, and then got scholarships to continue on and became anthropologists. And you can see them in the reports of the USAID, who are continuously hiring these people as they kind of develop a career, if you will, a personality that's both academic, but also functioning in, whether it be formally in the U.S. government agency or for the international agencies like the UN, or increasingly now even through these so-called NGOs that are operating in theory independently from either. So there are clear career trajectories that can sometimes take people who want to do good into kind of a logical direction that ultimately leads them, even if they don't profess that they are doing this or even admit that they're doing this, to de facto help empire along its way. And it really does, in the case of Yemen, which I talk about extensively in chapter 4 of the book. It's an interesting story to follow the careers of important voices in the academic world who start out their lives working for, whether it be Peace Corps or for so-called development agencies at the time. And I would suspect that we're seeing a similar kind of new generation of advocates who, in their own LinkedIn profiles, consider themselves to be defenders of the poor and the weak of the world, but who, by the very fact of their association with agencies, NGOs, and how they actually fund these operations, are in fact providing cover for this last stage of imperialism that accesses the last levels of resistance that come in the form of parallel economies, right? Actors in mafias or actors in smuggling complexes, or in places like Yemen where you have still well-armed militias who are able to be mobilized to resist the physical occupation of their country. So I wish your student well, and hopefully at one point she realizes that she's actually not in any ways resisting empire by even servicing them at that level.
It's funny you mention that, because I was in the Peace Corps, and on the precursor to this podcast on my previous channel, with my class, we interviewed John Perkins, the economic hitman, and that's up online. So let's get into the war in Yemen. Mainstream media provides us with sort of a banal version of events related to the war. If you look at BBC, CNN, and just before the podcast, I was browsing Google News, and it's just dozens of stories discussing the famine, occasionally Saudi Arabia, but never the real root causes of the war, which you in detail, almost in technical detail, describe in your book, going back a century up until today. And the other version suggests sort of that the war is just a continuation of, the empire, US, UK, EU, NATO, Saudi, Israeli proxy warfare, basically designed to regime change independent players, such as we've seen in Iraq, Libya, Syria, now Yemen, and Iran potentially. Some of the context you provide, that it seemed like it was unfinished Saudi business from a century ago, where the Saudis were trying to annex parts of Yemen. So can you tell us, and the other point is that Yemen held out against the empire for a long time until President Saleh sold out Yemen to the imperial interests, which included the Bush dynasty, oil companies, and so on. So can you tell us briefly who are the main players in the Yemen war? What are the main causes of it, the real motivations?
Well, if we consider that this 2015 blip, it is now heavy investment in direct military intervention. It was a response to a failed attempt of a transition, if you will, an interim period in which the United States and its regional ally, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, tried to impose a transitional regime under the name of former Vice President Ali Abdullah Saleh, the man who ruled Yemen through his various alliances over the years for 32 years. So Mansour Hadi, Hadi, that proved to be a failure. He was certainly successful in introducing new austerity, which prior to his entry in 2012 as that intermediary short-term president at the insistence of the United Nations Security Council and the local powers, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and the US, of course, being the principal supporter of this. Yemen was under, very much like many other countries, facing financial problems. There were pressures on the Saleh regime to help implement austerity on large aspects of the society. There were, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, attempts to integrate the Yemeni economy into what we would call this global economy or processes of globalization, neoliberal reforms, which were structural. And what's so interesting about the previous regime that's ultimately deemed to be no longer pliable and viable and reliable because of the events of 2010, 2011, the so-called Arab Spring playing itself out in very distinctive ways throughout Yemen, was that he was, Ali Abdullah Saleh, just very much like Yemenis in the past, continued to buy time to balance competing interests. So China became an important player. The close relationship that Ali Abdullah Saleh had with Abu Dhabi, whose investment in certain key assets was deemed to be a direct source of conflict for other interested parties, including the Americans under Barack Obama, and the Clintons and the neocons and more generally, as they've now shown their face with now confronted by this phenomenon of Trump and the what we call the Tea movement, so-called Tea movement, that Bannon was able to mobilize. There's resentment of empire and how it was exploiting largely white, what used to be middle-class America, impoverishing the working class, if you will, and the middle class in the United States, is a byproduct of, in the case of Yemen, open rebellion to what were concessions ultimately given by Ali Abdullah Saleh to cut back food subsidies in food and fuel, the continuously plundering of the national wealth in oil. Even though revenue was dropping, there was limited investment in expanding capacity. There was the continuous violent struggle in the Northwest for securitizing, if you will, a newly established frontier, which was imposed in the year 2000 between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So there are all kinds of factors that are contributing to why Yemenis collectively are revolting, and why certain areas of Yemen and let's say a long-term rebellion to central state and the imposition of IMF demands on austerity, the restructuring of the Yemeni economy to become more serviceable to neoliberal globalization, if you will, including the opening up of the Yemeni economy to outside investment, using the capacity of the Yemeni state to borrow money to basically pay for developing infrastructure that would later then be, of course, serviceable to global interests, whether it be banks who will profit from the debt, that would anchor the future of Yemen, and then the natural resources that would be used as collateral. I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but why the war is because this Hadi interim government, who was reimposing this period of austerity, integrating Yemen into the World Trade Organization's regime, which would fit the IMF and World Bank's demands for continued structural adjustments. And more importantly, the reassertion, or for the first time, the political assertion of especially Qatari interests through the Islah Party, which is a Muslim Brotherhood-backed party that in many ways the Saudis, interesting enough, were also quite supportive of. And it just blew up. By 2014, the kinds of political violence that was a result of this short-term regime, the attempts by certain external players to help expedite this process of integration, the imposition, as I write in my book, of this attempt to federalize Yemen, to break it up and disaggregate the territories of Yemen into more pliable independently administered zones in which much of the oil wealth and offshore, especially offshore, but also on land oil wealth, gas, and mining, which is based in largely unpopulated parts of central and eastern Yemen, what used to be South Yemen when it was an independent country, was going to go to a very small group of interested allies of empire and a small population. So that was ultimately the response that came from this process, this taking over of Sana'a, the arresting of this Hadi, accusing him of corruption, and basically making this cry for, we Yemenis deserve to be part of this process. We need to be at the table to negotiate this. We can't just have somebody signing off on behalf of all of Yemen, its future. And in all this scrambled also for global, for what remains of global liquidity, what remains of the potential that Yemen offered in terms of developing very lucrative assets, like its fisheries, like its oil and gas, which was again still at its rudimentary level of exploitation, demanded that Yemen could not go back to a period in which it was off the grid, if you will, of the global economy. And it certainly couldn't, the interested parties couldn't countenance a well-established nationalist, patriotic, and also very spirited resistance that showed military capacity under the coalition of Ansar Allah, which has been characterized as a proxy of Iran and its Shia movement under the charismatic leadership of someone called Houthi. That's all nonsense. These are all cover for making this a simple story of struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or this discourse about trying to replace a legitimate government by the name of Hadi, who was, again, had no legitimacy. There was no election. There was no integration and no discussion at some kind of negotiation table, including many peoples who were principally the ones resisting until today. And at the same time, we were seeing it, Saudi Arabia in particular, as an enterprise in this global struggle for what was available of liquidity, suffering under a serious downturn in revenues, whether due to low oil prices and this constant demand that it contribute to the global economy. that it continue to play a central role in siphoning off resources of the larger region. The fact that Syria did not collapse, the fact that there were still considerable, let's say, assets like Yemen off the grid, made it quite clear to certain interested parties in Saudi Arabia that this was their last chance to securing resources, that it would need to continue on with this, let's say, new era of Saudi political economy. And that includes issuing the IPO for Aramco. And as I argue in the book, and something that's actually very much hidden in even in the mainstream financial news, whether it be Financial Times or Reuters or Wall Street Journal, is that one of the reasons why the IPO did not work is that Aramco actually doesn't have an oil reserves that it claims it has. It actually, no one will put money into Aramco if it is basically dependent on the available oil resources of territorial Saudi Arabia. The whole idea about this war in many ways is to secure the natural resources that are just on the other side of the Saudi border in Yemen, which are considerable. Many areas of Yemen have yet to be explored because Yemen has long been able to, as a sovereign independent state, demand very high standards of engagement with oil companies. So much of Yemen's offshore, especially offshore assets, which includes the Horn of Africa, by the way, oil and gas, has not been explored properly. And as we're already beginning to see in places like Puntland, where there are Australian and Italian companies that are drilling and finding huge oil wells and oil reserves and natural gas, that the suspicion is that there's tons of that stuff offshore of Yemen. And so any country in the region they could capture this would guarantee the ability to finance any kind of 2030 project that's now associated with Mohammed bin Salman, for instance. The whole idea of building and developing the western coast of Saudi Arabia, akin to what happened in Dubai, was really the only economic program for the future of the Arabian Peninsula. The fact that they don't have the resources and the global markets understand that. If you talk to brokers, oil brokers, they all understand that Aramco buys oil offshore, puts a flag on it and claims that it's Saudi oil, where in fact it's bought from the open market. So Aramco doesn't have natural resources and it needs Yemen's natural resources. So there's some ways to account for why this war in 2015 took place. And I can elaborate more about why the GCC is actually, and the whole coalition is in fact a front for and a cover for a much more complicated political, let's say, struggle between what was once deemed to be partners in the GCC regarding this war on Yemen.
If I'm not mistaken, in your book, you said that the empire had to destroy Yemen, that was their best option. And as well, you tie Yemen to the decline or fall of the empire, whether it's the U.S. and I think you've also mentioned like the 2007, 2008 crisis, and as well as the liquidity. And we've got these astronomical debts. We're running out of runway here, and I don't know if they need further resources to keep from collapsing. So I mean, all these different ideas I'm mentioning, is there something there?
No, absolutely. Again, the global south is a wonderful last bit of resource to plunder, especially savings, whether it be Indians, Pakistani, Afghani private money that goes to develop and to invest in properties, whether it be in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. Yemen was certainly on the radar screen for developers. There were some mega projects that were on the drawing board. Qatari money was going into building up kind of gated communities outside of Sana'a. Dubai Ports World, some of their partners were looking not only to invest in ports themselves, but the considerable assets that were on associated with Aden, for instance, or Mukalla. There was plenty of areas for speculative real estate. Again, following the model of Dubai, making bringing value to what was otherwise just desert, making something that didn't have any intrinsic value just by marketing it as land that could be used to develop vacation spots. And this is something that the Saud family, certain elements of the Saud family, saw this as a working model, hoping that they could do similar things to the Red Sea coastline. They had all these envisioned 2030 project. They envisioned building cities akin to what you have in the UAE. And this was, in a regional context, all magnets for so-called third world savings or cash. And unfortunately for empire, as you can tie this in with what happened in 2007, 2008, this scramble now for trying to find ways to cover for all the losses that, yes, implicated the larger global economy, and not only American or British or Icelandic banks suffered, but because of how money now circulates and where liquidity comes into actually shoring up empire's economy. It depends on the ability of savers to no longer put their money underneath their mattress, but actually put their money into equity markets and buying insurance and borrowing money to buy their own kind of dream home. So the kind of economy that emerged in North America and then later on a little bit in Europe was spreading throughout the world. The promise is that if some of this savings flows into territories and areas that remain off the grid for as far as empire is concerned, it creates global shifts. Whether it's manifested in China or if it's manifested in Russia, that becomes increasingly important autonomous players in the global economy. If it's Libya threatening to create a gold-backed currency on behalf of Africa, or the simple move away from buying or selling oil from the dollar to the euro or alternative currencies, whether it be a gold-backed Chinese currency or something else. These are all interconnected in interesting ways that I try to lay out in the case for Yemen, that even though Yemen's economy is nowhere near as important and significant, let's say, as China, that so many of these factors were converging at interesting moments onto Yemen. So Islamic finance, micro loans, these kinds of things that were actually playing itself out in Yemen as a kind of laboratory, if you will, for future expansion of these same programs throughout the Middle East, are all warning signs to ultimately now, when the primary intermediaries for this are on the edge of financial disaster themselves, it becomes now a point where if they could not, and they cannot, obviously, after 3.5 years, they have not been able to subdue North Yemen. And because the coalition itself is actually disguising the competition between three rival regional powers or claimants to exclusive authority over the future relationship between empire and the Middle East. And here I meant the Saud family, the Thani family in Qatar, and the UAE to a more interesting way. Means that the failure to actually come to a resolution in Yemen has exposed the family in Saud in particular to financial disaster. We have now heard Trump a couple of weeks ago warn openly in public that to the family in Saudi Arabia that their time is up. It's clear that over the last year they're not paying the bills. So these seemingly public clashes with Canada and Germany are really about unpaid bills. And now the United States military-industrial complex, I think, has also now realized that it's run its course as far as cash payments for those weapons that are seemingly a very lucrative business, but they can only come in the form of direct payments. No one will accept Saudi credit anymore because everyone knows that they're bankrupt, that this war has bankrupted Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was already bankrupt in many ways. It doesn't have the oil, and it's not able to exploit the oil fields of Yemen to make Aramco that one last bit of asset that they could actually issue an IPO and produce hundreds of billions of dollars of inflow of cash, of investors' cash. So we need to actually be sophisticated observers of how global economy works, how finance works, and how it's playing itself out in a corner of the world that is never associated with these kinds of the political economy of finance. And it behooves those who are looking at Congo or looking at conflicts over Venezuela today and future conflicts elsewhere in similar terms, I think. If anything, this book provides a kind of working model for us to investigate a new conflict and what's going on as we move forward now.
Can you comment on the civilian casualties, the destruction of the infrastructure in Yemen, as well as the use of cluster bombs, phosphorus, obviously the indiscriminate targeting of civilians? I think I just read today or yesterday the Saudis and the Americans, again, further drone strikes, airstrikes, and as well as your comments on the recent report or allegation that the Saudi journalist Khashoggi that was killed because he was possibly going to expose Saudi use of chemical weapons in Yemen.
These are all complicated. There are all kinds of tangents we can go off on all of this, but just to keep it simple, I guess, in a sad way, the idea was to destroy this infrastructure very quickly. Within the first couple of days, most of the bridges that were linking the highlands of Yemen to the coastal areas were destroyed. The idea was to make the infrastructure inoperable, making it difficult to distribute food, let alone distribute weapons and soldiers, right? But the idea that if we attack the infrastructure of the limited agricultural industry, they attacked dairy farms, they attacked water wells. The use of cluster bombs was primarily along in farmlands, somewhat akin to the use of Agent Orange to destroy forests, to somewhat make it difficult for the Viet Cong to continue their resistance in the countryside. The idea was to starve into submission or to threaten the larger civilian population. What this suggests is that there was an understanding from the very beginning, intelligence, whether it be the U.S. directly or if you want to call it, Saudis had their own independent sources of information. They knew very well that those who were going to fight against the so-called coalition were popularly backed, that they did have the support of a large segment of North Yemeni population, at least. And the fact that they were able to come so quickly and enter into the fray of southern Yemen and actually occupy Aden for a moment was an indication that this is a widespread, potentially a widespread war of attrition that they were hoping that it can intimidate the population and basically takes the popular support away from those who are willing to fight. But what this has done is only intensified the support, not necessarily for one particular party or one particular axis of a coalition, but they support the idea of defending Yemen from especially Saudi Arabia. Now, that does not exonerate Qatar at all. It's been completely eliminated from the discussions about what is happening in Yemen, which I find very instructive. And I beseech your audience to consider that this is an important element moving forward. The fact that the Mohammed bin Salman is representative now of a larger problem called Saudi Arabia is first and foremost an indication that they failed in their project of becoming and finding a viable long-term solution to their financial problem. there was even the possibility of occupying Qatar after this kind of ideological spat over who's going to get the spoils of the war, of winning the war in Yemen, proved unfeasible because they couldn't win the war in Yemen. Meant that the potential of actually just simply occupying, like it happened in Bahrain in 2011, occupying Qatar and its huge gas resources would have resolved Saudi Arabia's problems. Of course, Turkey, Iran, and UAE intervened in their own ways, in interesting ways, in that respect. So the use of certain kinds of weapons are strategic. They are meant to intimidate. Some were experimental. There was certainly a bunker busting bomb dropped in 2016 that looked very suspicious to many scientists who looked at the video. It certainly was not a conventional weapon. It will take some time, if ever, we're going to have more clarification as to what that was. And I just suggest to your audience to take a look at some of the YouTube video of this and just type in nuclear bomb Yemen, and then you can have all the speculation that comes with the comments underneath those images. But certainly weapons that are deemed illegal in any context have been regularly used in Iraq or in Syria and Libya, are certainly being used also in Yemen. And the enterprise of winning a war by trying to intimidate the civilian population from supporting the resistance is now becomes one. It's no longer a war of attrition. It's outright starvation. And that's probably been already at play for a while now, even though finally the mainstream media, largely because clearly the fate of Saudi Arabia, the family as a whole, or certainly Mohammed bin Salman, has been more or less determined that it's over for him as a personality, and maybe again the family, as I suggested in my book, over the long term. Now the issue is, where are we going to go from here? The fact that the mainstream media is saying that there is starvation means that this is maybe a window of opportunity to justify a more heavy investment in direct intervention, which is clearly related to which of the GCC powers are going to actually become the intermediaries on behalf of empire moving forward. And I doubt it's going to be the Saud family. I doubt it's been resolved yet, however, and it's going to be quite nasty because the resistance will continue. They have not been able to subdue the resistance in the northern part of the country. The southern part of the country, which has been under competition between these various interested regional powers, has played itself out in very nasty ways in Aden and in parts of the oil-rich areas of Hadramaut. So it's just getting actually more messy. This 30-day window, which was given by the General United States, Mattis, to get these things resolved, that there will be a ceasefire within 30 days, was this last invitation to resolve this war, to capture the port of Hodeidah, to isolate the north of Yemen, to make food, the weapon of food and starvation, that more pronounced. Because for whatever purpose, whatever reason, North Yemen is still able to function as a viable resistance to what is supposedly the most impressive military alliance the Middle East has seen for decades, and yet it's not able to subdue, whether it be through direct military confrontation, the use of air power, the use of illegal weapons, and the use of starvation. Yemenis in the north have continued and will continue to resist, and actually they're getting stronger, it seems. So now the empire has intervened. The narrative is changed dramatically. The relationship, the precarious relationship that Saudi Arabia has had with empire is now been exposed, and it's good riddance, as I suggested in the book. And that means with the end of the Saudi family, as we know it at least, that means empire itself is dramatically changing structurally. Where it goes from here is anyone's guess.
And I'll have one final question as we're running out of time. But you answered a large portion of it. But do you feel the end to the war in Yemen, that it will remain localized? You mentioned Bashar al-Assad and how he has managed to hold Syria with the assistance of the Russians, and they're stable for now. So do you see the Yemen war ending in a localized manner, or the potential for, as you mentioned, with the potential fall of Saudi Arabia and their problems, as well as the empire, that it could lead to a larger, how would you say, regional war?
Yeah, it's certainly not clear when the maps will inevitably be redrawn in relation to larger Arabia, how that's going to play out and why it's going to play out the way it does. I think there will be continued violence in many parts of what we today associate with Yemen. I don't think politically it will ever be reconstituted as a unified country, unfortunately, for Yemenis, for a large majority of Yemenis who still believe in a unified Yemen. That's certainly off the that's not an option anymore, as Libya has been completely fragmented into at least three distinctive territories. Iraq, in many ways, has also been permanently segregated. And unfortunately for Syria, east of Euphrates is open zone. There are large tracts along the Turkish border that will likely be either integrated directly and even legalized at some point. Annexation of those territories, it will remain in limbo for decades. And that's what I'm afraid is going to happen in Yemen. But that just means that there'll be violence. There'll be continued violence. And because of Yemenis who have long cultural links to the larger region, whether as guest workers in the Gulf economies or on the entire frontiers and what is southwest Saudi Arabia today, they will certainly contribute to whatever happens to the next 20 years in that part of the world. And it will likely also translate to new dynamics of violence in the Horn of Africa, I'm afraid, because many of the same factors that contributed to violence in Somalia and in the Ogaden region of Ethiopia for the last 20, 30 years have not been resolved. They're reanimating a sense of regional alliances, which is, I think, positive, but it could easily be an area of new investment by empire to wrest free from these areas ever becoming integrated into areas outside of the direct influence of empire. And now I'm referring to what will happen if China and Russia finally step into this part of the world, as they have apparently done quite late in the game in Syria. So those factors have yet to step in. So it will change dramatically how the ultimate end of the Saudi family role to play in the future of the world, how that will play out on the ground. But certainly many of these well-armed and now quite impressively organized forces that are resisting the coalition against Yemen now will have a role to play in whatever is going to be deemed the future of that part of the world. So I don't see violence anytime soon ending, unfortunately. Yemen has been in the throes of a violent exchange with empire for 100 years. And unfortunately for them, until empire itself completely changes, which it is. It's structurally changing throughout in many different places. But until that is actually complete, Yemen itself will, the people in Yemen will experience various levels of violence for decades, I'm afraid.
Is there any greater point that I may have missed, or any final thought you'd like to leave us with?
No, just wish your listeners that they spend as much time as possible reading across different genres of scholarship and analysis, and be weary of media campaigns that have intensified as of late, focusing on the evils of Mohammed bin Salman or UAE and exonerating other actors who have long been important and indeed equally culpable actors. And I'm speaking specifically of Qatar and Turkey. And certainly don't, I'm sure your audience doesn't do this, but certainly don't let the Americans now co-opt a story that they're intervening to save Yemen or something.
And how can people best follow you and your work?
Find a way to acquire a copy, legal or illegal, of my book. Many of the things that I've published in the past have been downloaded or uploaded to academy.edu. And I have a Twitter account. You're welcome to see whatever I'm saying on Twitter. And it's my name, Isa.Blumi.
Well, I urge all listeners to go out and purchase Dr. Blumi's book, Destroying Yemen. I just finished reading it, and I gave it a great review. You can get the paperback or the ebook version, and do leave him a review as well if you purchase the legal copy. And the book really does provide geopolitical insights, as we've been talking about, not only into Yemen, but the Middle East, as well as around the world. So thank you again for your time and for this interview, Dr. Blumi.